27 million visitors a year, more than most countries see in a lifetime. A horse once dove off a platform into a tank of water, and a crowd of thousands lost its mind and came back the next day to watch it happen again. A board game used its streets to map out the geography of American ambition, and for 90 years, every family in the country argued over who got to own them. And by 2020, more than 1 in 3 people living there were below the poverty line. If you grew up anywhere on the East Coast between 1900 and 1960, there was one place your family saved up for. One place that existed outside the ordinary calendar of ordinary life. The boardwalk stretched for miles. The ocean hit you before you could see it. The salt air and the fry oil and the sound of 10,000 people who had earned a weekend and intended to use it. And everywhere you looked, something that felt like it had been built specifically, personally for you. That place was Atlantic City, and this is what happened to it. Before Atlantic City existed, there was nothing there worth mentioning. A long, low barrier island off the coast of New Jersey. Marshy ground, scrub grass, salt wind, and sand that went everywhere and stayed there. The Lenni Lenape people had known it for centuries. A few hunters passed through, a handful of settlers tried to make something of it and mostly failed. It had no harbor worth using, no farmland worth plowing, no reason to exist as anything other than what it was, which was a strip of wet sand between the Pine Barrens and the Atlantic Ocean that nobody particularly needed. Then a doctor showed up and changed everything. Jonathan Pitney was not from the island. He lived on the New Jersey mainland in Absecon, and he had a theory. The theory was that salt air cured things. Not metaphorically, literally. He believed that ocean air carried healing properties, that the sick and the tired and the worn-down people of Philadelphia and the surrounding region could be made well simply by breathing the air that came off the water. He was a doctor and a promoter in equal measure, which is to say he believed what he said and he also knew how to sell it. He began telling anyone who would listen that the shore was medicine, that the ocean was medicine, that what ailing people needed was not another doctor's office in another city, but a train ride to the edge of the continent and a lungful of Atlantic air. The theory was not entirely wrong. Fresh air and rest did help people, and Pitney was persuasive enough that the people who needed to listen eventually did. The railroad made it real. In 1854, a direct rail line opened between Philadelphia and the Jersey Shore, Camden and Atlantic Railroad. 1 hour and 40 minutes from the city to the ocean. Before that line existed, the island was inaccessible to anyone without a boat and a reason to bother. After that line opened, it was 1 hour and 40 minutes from one of the largest cities in America. That is the whole story of Atlantic City's birth. Not a visionary plan, not a grand design. A railroad and a schedule, and the simple arithmetic of distance collapsed into time. The numbers tell you everything. In 1854, roughly 250 people lived on Absecon Island. By 1900, the census counted over 27,000 residents. That is not growth. That is a city conjured out of marsh grass and sea wind in less than 50 years, pulled into existence by a single rail line and a doctor who believed in salt air. Hotels went up, then more hotels. Then boarding houses and restaurants and shops and everything a city of visitors needs to become a city of residents. People came for a weekend, and some of them never left. The island filled in the way a tide pool fills, quickly and completely, until there was no room left that wasn't occupied by something someone had built. And then the sand became a problem. It was everywhere. It is the nature of barrier islands, of beaches, of any place where the line between land and ocean is a suggestion rather than a boundary. People walked in off the beach and brought it with them. Into the hotel lobbies, into the dining rooms, into the rail cars heading back to Philadelphia. The hotels complained. The railroad complained. Everyone with a floor to sweep complained. It was not an elegant problem. It was not the kind of problem that seemed like it would lead anywhere important. It was just sand. In 1870, a railroad conductor named Alexander Boardman was asked to think of a solution. He sat down with a hotel owner named Jacob Keim and they came up with something simple: a wooden walkway. 8 feet wide, built along the beach, giving visitors a path from the hotels to the shore and back again that was not the beach itself. A surface you could walk on without bringing the beach inside. They took the idea to city council. The cost was significant, roughly half of the city's entire annual tax revenue. The council approved it anyway. That was it. That was the whole idea. A practical solution to a maddening nuisance. A plank road above the sand so people would stop tracking it indoors. Nobody in that council chamber was thinking about American history. Nobody was thinking about a board game or a beauty pageant, or a city that would one day pull 27 million visitors a year through its doors. They were thinking about sand on carpets and complaints from hotel managers. The boardwalk they built that year became the most famous stretch of pavement in the history of this country. That is how Atlantic City was born. A doctor with a theory, a railroad with a schedule, and a conductor who was tired of sweeping up after people. Picture the boardwalk on a Saturday night in 1930. Not an empty boardwalk, not a quiet one. A boardwalk so full of people you could walk its length without ever seeing the ocean over the crowd. The lights of Steel Pier blazing out over the water. The smell of salt air mixed with fry oil and perfume and something sweet you couldn't quite place. Women in their best dresses, men in suits even in August because this was the kind of place you dressed for. Not because anyone told you to, because the place itself demanded it. Because you had saved up for this, driven or trained in from Philadelphia or Newark or Baltimore, and you were not going to show up looking like you didn't know where you were. You knew exactly where you were. Everyone did. This was Atlantic City, the world's playground. And for a few decades in the middle of the 20th century, there was nowhere else on Earth quite like it. The people who came were not the wealthy. That is the part that matters most and gets forgotten first. Atlantic City was not built for the Vanderbilts. It was not a Newport, not a Palm Beach, not a place where money kept the gates closed. It was built for factory workers from Philadelphia and garment workers from New York, and families from 100 small cities in between who had been saving since January for one big summer trip. 1 week, maybe 2, if things had gone well that year. They came by the trainload and they spent what they had, and they felt maybe for the only time all year like the world had made something for them. That is why the nostalgia runs so deep and so long. It was their place. Not a place they were allowed into. Theirs. Steel Pier opened in 1898, and by the 1920s, it was the crown jewel of the entire Atlantic coast. A pier that extended 2,000 feet into the ocean, and on it, everything you could think of and several things you couldn't. Big bands, vaudeville acts, amusement rides, restaurants, and the diving horse. You need to stop on the diving horse because nothing about it makes sense until you understand that it made perfect sense at the time. A horse, a real horse, would be ridden by a rider up a ramp and off a platform 40 feet above a tank of water, and the horse would fall through the air and hit the water, and the crowd would lose its mind completely. Every single time. Not once. Multiple times a day, every day, all summer long. Thousands of people packed the viewing stands to watch it happen and went home and told everyone they knew. That was Steel Pier. That was what you came for. The rolling chairs came earlier, 1876, introduced first for visitors who couldn't walk the length of the boardwalk on their own. By 1887, they were available to everyone. Wicker chairs on wheels, pushed by attendants along the boards carrying you past the storefronts and the arcades and the saltwater taffy shops and the piers while you sat back and watched it all go by. Being pushed down the boardwalk in a rolling chair was the signature experience of Atlantic City in the way that nothing else was. Not because of where you went, because of what it felt like. Like the city itself was carrying you. Like you had earned for one afternoon the right to stop moving and let someone else do the work. Miss America began in 1921. The pageant was invented to extend the tourist season past Labor Day, a practical calculation dressed up in crowns and evening gowns. By the early 1960s, it was the highest-rated program on American television. Not one of the highest-rated. The highest. The whole country watched it in the same way. The whole country watched the moon landing. Atlantic City was not just a resort by then. It was a national institution. And then there was Monopoly. In 1935, Parker Brothers released a board game that Charles Darrow had drawn from the streets of Atlantic City. Boardwalk, Park Place, Atlantic Avenue, Baltic Avenue, Marvin Gardens. The city's geography became the map that every American family argued over on rainy Sunday afternoons for the next 90 years. You grew up knowing what the boardwalk was worth before you ever set foot on it. The most expensive property on the board, the one everyone wanted, the one that ended friendships, add prohibition, and it becomes something else entirely. The laws existed everywhere in America from 1920 to 1933. They did not particularly exist in Atlantic City. Political boss Enoch Nucky Johnson controlled liquor and gambling, and a great deal more across the entire eastern seaboard, and he made certain the party in his city never stopped. 40% of all illegal alcohol entering the United States came through Atlantic City or near it. Not 10%, not a notable share. 40. The party never stopped because one man decided it wouldn't, and everyone with money to spend was grateful he did. This was the Golden Age. And like every Golden Age, nobody living inside it knew it was ending. It did not end all at once. That is never how it happens. The Golden Age of Atlantic City did not conclude with a single disaster or a single decision. It dissolved. Slowly at first, then faster, the way a sandcastle holds its shape through the first small waves and then simply isn't there anymore. The car killed it. Not immediately, not obviously, but completely. For decades, Atlantic City had one advantage over every other resort on the eastern seaboard, and that advantage was the railroad. You did not need money or leisure or a complicated plan. You needed a train ticket and a weekend. The railroad made Atlantic City democratic, made it accessible, made it the place a factory worker from South Philadelphia could reach in under 2 hours with his family on a Friday evening. When Americans got cars, that advantage disappeared. With a car, you could go anywhere. You could find a lake in the mountains or a beach in Delaware or a campsite in the Catskills. You could drive somewhere new every summer and never repeat yourself. Why go back to the same shore town your grandfather went to when the road in front of you went in every direction at once? The trains kept running. Fewer people got on them. Then the war came and took what was left of the old order with it. The United States Army looked at Atlantic City and saw exactly what it was. A dense collection of large buildings close to the coast, close to rail lines, close to nothing strategically important. They commandeered the hotels. The grand hotels that had defined the city for half a century became military barracks and training facilities. Soldiers slept in the rooms where families had honeymooned and vacationed and celebrated anniversaries. It was not malicious. It was wartime arithmetic. The buildings were there, and the army needed them. When the soldiers left, the city tried to become itself again. It could not. The federal government had grown during the war. The state government had grown. The mechanisms that Nucky Johnson had used to keep the liquor flowing, and the gambling running, and the whole beautiful legal machinery of the Golden Age turning, were suddenly exposed to a level of scrutiny they had never faced before. The outside-the-law magic that made Atlantic City what it was could not survive the post-war world. The party that had run for decades stopped, not with a raid or an arrest, but with the slow, suffocating weight of a government that was now paying attention. In 1951, a Senate committee investigating organized crime across the country came to Atlantic City. A senator from Wyoming stood up and called the city pretty rotten. He was not wrong, and everyone knew he was not wrong. The investigations that followed accelerated what the cars and the post-war crackdown had already started. Jobs left. Businesses closed. The visitors who had filled the hotels every summer found other places to go, places that were newer and cheaper and did not carry the particular exhaustion of a city losing its reason for existing. Residents followed the jobs out. Poverty moved into the neighborhoods they left behind. Crime followed the poverty. Blight followed the crime. By the early 1970s, the city that had once drawn millions of Americans to its boardwalk every summer was broken. Not struggling, not declining, broken. The grand hotels stood, but many of them were not grand anymore. The boardwalk was still there, but what it held had changed into something nobody had saved up all winter to see. The people who were left needed a miracle, and in 1976, New Jersey gave them what looked like one. That year, New Jersey voters approved casino gambling in Atlantic City. The logic was straightforward and desperate in equal measure. The city was dying. The gambling industry had money. Let the gambling industry save the city. Let the casinos bring the tourists back, rebuild the hotels, create the jobs, restore what had been lost. It was a Faustian bargain, and the people who made it knew it was a Faustian bargain, and they made it anyway because the alternative was watching the city finish dying, and they were not ready to do that. On May 27, 1978, Resorts International opened its doors. Thousands of people crowded the boardwalk with money they could not wait to spend. It was the first legalized gambling operation outside of Nevada in the entire country. Politicians stood at podiums and spoke about renewal. Residents stood in the crowd and felt something they had not felt in years, which was hope. For a while, it seemed like the miracle had actually arrived. The money came in, the jobs came back. New towers rose along the boardwalk. Atlantic City called itself the Las Vegas of the East, and for a moment in the early 1980s, standing on the boardwalk at night with the casino lights blazing out over the ocean, you could almost believe it. Almost. In 1986, a local retailer named Murray Ralphel said what everyone was thinking but nobody in a position of power wanted to hear. It was once a slum, he said. Now it is a slum with casinos. He was right. The gamblers came and lost their money and left. They did not eat at local restaurants. They did not browse local shops. They did not walk the boardwalk the way the families from Philadelphia had walked it in 1930. They sat at machines in rooms with no windows and no clocks and no reason to go outside, and when their money was gone, they got in their cars and drove home. By 1999, researchers studying the gambling industry found that hundreds of independent restaurants and bars in Atlantic City had closed after the casinos opened. Not before. After. The miracle had arrived. It just wasn't for the city. The casinos had one advantage, and they had always had exactly one advantage. Atlantic City was the only place on the East Coast where you could legally gamble. That was it. That was the entire value proposition. Not the ocean, not the boardwalk, not the salt air or the rolling chairs or the memory of Steel Pier. The gambling. And as long as no one else had gambling, people would make the drive, sit down at the machines, lose their money, and go home. The city did not need to be good. It only needed to be the only option. The moment it stopped being the only option, everything that had been pretending to hold together stopped pretending. Connecticut legalized gambling, then Delaware, then Pennsylvania, then Maryland, then New York. One by one, across the entire region that Atlantic City had called its customer base for 30 years, casinos opened closer to where people actually lived. And the math that destroyed the city was not complicated. It was the simplest math imaginable. People putting money into slot machines would rather do that 15 minutes from home than drive more than an hour. They were never coming for the ocean air. They were never coming for the boardwalk. They were coming because Atlantic City was the closest place they could do what they wanted to do. And the moment something closer existed, Atlantic City ceased to matter to them entirely. The revenue numbers tell the story in one direction, and they never reverse. Visitors declined. Casino revenues declined. The city that had borrowed against a future that was no longer arriving found itself buried under obligations it had no way of meeting. Casinos that had been profitable became casinos that were merely surviving. Casinos that were merely surviving became casinos that were not surviving at all. Then came 2014. In a single year, 4 major casinos closed. Trump Plaza closed. Showboat closed. The Atlantic Club closed. And Revel closed. Revel is the one that requires a moment of stillness because the numbers surrounding it are almost impossible to absorb without stopping. Revel cost $2.4 billion to build. $2.4 billion. It opened in 2012 as the most expensive construction project in the history of New Jersey, a tower of glass and ambition rising over the northern end of the boardwalk. The thing that was supposed to prove Atlantic City still had a future. It lasted just over 2 years. It closed in 2014, having never found a way to make $2.4 billion feel like a reasonable idea. It sat empty on the boardwalk for years afterward, a glass monument to a bet that nobody had thought all the way through. 8,000 jobs disappeared in 2014 alone. Not over a decade. Not gradually, in a single year. People who had built their lives around the casino industry, who had mortgages and children in school and 15 or 20 years in the same building, walked out of work in 2014 and did not walk back in. The city found itself $260 million in debt. Its credit ratings had been destroyed. The tax base that the casinos had been supposed to provide had collapsed along with the casinos themselves. The neighborhoods that had never benefited from the gambling boom, the residential blocks away from the boardwalk where regular people actually lived, had been absorbing poverty and blight and disinvestment for decades. And now, even the thin argument that the casinos were good for the city could not be sustained by anyone trying to say it with a straight face. By 2020, the poverty rate in Atlantic City was 35.2%. More than 1 in 3 people living in the city that had once called itself the world's playground were living below the poverty line. The national poverty rate that year was around 11%. Atlantic City was 3 times that. 3 times the national average in a city that had hosted 27 million visitors a year, that had once been the most famous resort in the country, that had sat at the center of American leisure and aspiration for the better part of a century. The boardwalk still stands. The ocean is still there, still rolling in the same way it rolled in when Jonathan Pitney stood on the shore in the 1840s and told anyone who would listen that the air off the water was medicine. The air is still the same air, but where the Grand Hotel stood, there are vacant lots. Where the towers rose in the brief casino boom, there are shuttered buildings with dark windows. Where the families from Philadelphia spread their blankets and the factory workers from New York walked in their best shoes and the whole democratic machinery of American leisure ran at full capacity, there's a city trying to remember what it was, and not entirely sure the memory is useful anymore. Atlantic City did not lose a gamble. It lost something harder to recover than money. It lost the thing that made people want to come in the first place, and then it spent 50 years trying to replace that thing with something that was never going to be a replacement. The ocean is still there. Everything else left. If you ever rode a rolling chair down the boardwalk and felt, for one afternoon, like the world was carrying you, if you ever stood on Steel Pier and watched a horse fall through the air and believed you were somewhere that could only exist in America, if you ever walked to the edge of the ocean with saltwater taffy in your hand and felt like this country had built something just for ordinary people and meant it, you remember Atlantic City, and you know exactly what was lost. Please subscribe.